Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. We're going to do something unique in today's video. We're just going to talk about games. Generally, I will do reviews and guides for hardware, but I get a lot of questions about what are my favorite games for any particular system. So I want to do a new series where I pick a system, in this example it's going to be NES, and then I'm going to talk about all my experiences, my favorite games with that particular system. So that's what we're going to do here today. Now I'm hoping this video is going to be helpful in two ways. Number one is if you've just never played NES before, I think that you'll find that this list is pretty eclectic and it's a great place to start. I'm not saying these are the top 15 games ever made for the NES, but these are the ones that really connected with me when I was younger, and so I hope you enjoy them too. Now if you're already familiar with the NES catalog, I'm hoping that there's maybe a hidden gem in here that you haven't heard of before, or if anything, this will just be a celebration of some of those really great games on the system. Like I mentioned, I don't think these are the top 15 games. You wouldn't find these on a list. And so maybe your favorite game isn't on this list, and that's totally cool. I think other people will have different lists. For me, this is just in particular the games that I really enjoyed, and we're going to talk about why. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. Now to start, I did mention this isn't going to be a hardware video, but all the same, I do want to talk about some of the handhelds that are really great when it comes to playing NES, and so let's talk about a few of those before we get started. I would say overall my favorite handheld to play when it comes to NES is actually the Powkiddy RGB30. This one costs about $90, but has a really unique screen. It's 4 inches and has a square aspect ratio with a 720p resolution. And I tend to play these games in an 8:7 aspect ratio on this display just because it fills out so much of the screen and it looks really great. This one also has support for a bunch of custom firmwares, including one called Jealous, which is the primary one I use on this device, and yeah, I just really love this experience. And so if you're looking for something under $100 that can play NES really well, then I would recommend this handheld. In fact, in my review of the RGB30, I did a whole section about the NES, and so I'll leave all that stuff linked down below. Another handheld that works really well with NES is actually the Steam Deck. This one has an aspect ratio of 16:10, and so when you're playing 4:3 content, which is usually what you'll play with NES, it actually fills out most of the screen, and so it looks really good. In addition, the Steam Deck is very comfortable to use and has a nice big display, and so it's really impressive to play NES games on it. Another handheld that's super impressive is the Analog Pocket. This one actually uses hardware emulation through a process called FPGA. Now essentially what this is doing is very accurately re-representing the NES, and so as a result it's a very accurate and faithful recreation of playing some of those games. Now this one's pretty expensive, it's around $250, and so it's not the cheapest way to play NES, and honestly I mostly play Game Boy on this one anyway just because it looks so good in this form factor, but all the same if you're looking for something very accurate, then I would recommend the Analog Pocket. Another device I really enjoy playing with NES is the Odin 2. This one recently came out and it's totally overkill. This one is over $300 and it can emulate up to GameCube, PS2, and Nintendo Switch. So it's definitely more powerful than you need for NES, but all the same I love the big 1080p display here. That means that all the pixel scaling is going to look really good, and so it's just a really fun way for me to play NES on. Now all the same, I also like having NES on the go, and so one of my favorite ways to play this system is actually the TrimUI Smart. This one is what I would call a micro handheld, so it's something that can easily fit in your pocket, but the MinUI operating system really makes this a joy to play. And I've got a whole video about this handheld and this operating system and how they play together so nicely, so I'll leave that link down below. But all the same, if you're looking for something to just throw in your pocket and play, I think the TrimUI Smart is a really great deal. Now it's a smaller kind of screen, so you're going to be squinting a little bit with certain games, so it's not a perfect setup, but all the same, it's really nice to have it in the pocket. And then finally, another great all-around handheld when it comes to playing NES is the Miyoo Mini Plus. This one is also on the small side, so I would consider it to be pocketable, but it also has a nice 4:3 aspect ratio display with a 480p resolution. That's going to look really good, especially if you're using Onion OS, which is the operating system I recommend for this. It's just going to be a really great plug and play experience when it comes to playing NES. And so yes, I know I'm going through this very quickly, but I did want to point out that there are many ways to play NES on a handheld, and depending on your preferences when it comes to size and screen, you've got a lot of options here. And I'll leave all this stuff linked down below if you want to watch more about any of these. Okay, so let's jump into the games, and I think we're going to have a lot of fun here, but I do have a couple notes. Number one, I'm not treating this like a documentary, so I'm not doing a bunch of research and then presenting it to you. Instead, we're mostly going to go off my own memories from back in the day. I want to talk about why I love these games so much and why they were revolutionary at the time, and then also I want to talk about why they're still great today. In addition, these games are going to be in alphabetical order. It's really hard to rank all of these. My favorite game of all time is still Super Mario Bros. 2, but after that it gets really muddy, and so instead I decided decided let's just play them in order, and it actually works out really well because it makes it a very eclectic list. So let's go ahead and get started with our number one game, which is going to be Batman. Now, I don't think we can talk about the Batman game without first talking about the 1989 Tim Burton movie. And I'm dating myself here, but I was 9 when that movie first came out, and it was just super awesome. Number one, we had grown up watching the older show from the 60s, and that was kind of cheesy, but still pretty cool. But then this was like a whole new level. It was dark and moody and funny, and then also had really great acting and a new Batmobile, and then also a soundtrack made by Prince. It was just like a perfect storm of coolness when I was 9 years old. And so when this game came out the following year in 1990, yeah, we played it a lot. It's not one that we actually owned, but we were rented all the time. Now, this game is tough as nails. It's a side-scrolling game. It actually reminds me a lot of Ninja Gaiden in the fact that you have like your own basic punch, but then you can also get other weapons and then use those. You only have a limited amount of ammunition for each of them, but it does give you an advantage depending on the enemy that you're playing against. Now, the game itself is not closely tied to the movie. In fact, there's only a couple times when it actually feels like it comes from the movie. There's a couple cutscenes, and also Joker is the end boss. But other than that, it's really mostly an action platformer that requires very precise controls. There's not a lot of variation when it comes to the levels, but all the same, the gameplay mechanic is very solid, and that was kind of rare with these movie tie-in games. And like I mentioned, it's a pretty challenging game. In fact, the only way I can beat it nowadays is to use cheat codes, and so it's definitely not a game I would recommend if you're looking for a relaxing jaunt through the NES catalog. But if you're looking for something that's a little bit more precision-oriented and a little bit challenging, then I think this is going to be a great time. Okay, the next game up is going to be Blaster Master. This is a game that I read about all the time in the magazines, but it was one that was kind of hard to find in real life. I don't know if it was just kind of rare, but all the same, when we did find it, we would rent it immediately. It was not a game that we actually owned. Now, the thing that's really amazing about Blaster Master is that it's super varied. In fact, there's like a really intricate backstory to it, and there's a whole cutscene at the beginning of the game. Now, essentially what happens is you have a pet frog and it escapes out of its bowl, and you obviously go and you chase it down a hole, which goes into the center of the world. While you're down there in the center of the earth, you meet this tank that you then get inside of, and then that becomes a part of you. And so you play the game inside of this tank for the most part. So you're like jumping around with this tank, which jumps, by the way, and it also can aim in all these different directions, which is a really unique mechanic for NES back in the day. Now, in addition, you can also get out of the tank and you'll be this little tiny guy in the overworld, but then you can go in these really small doors and all of a sudden you're like this huge character. And so it's almost like 2 games in one. And I was always really impressed at how big the sprite is. That's one of those really big things with the NES, was how big your character could be. The bigger the character, the better the graphics, so to speak. And so Blaster Master kind of had it all. It was a really kind of intense platforming game that also allowed you to shoot, but then also you could get out of your car and then go into this door and then have a completely different game experience as well. So if you're looking for a game that's kind of surprisingly complex and deep, then I would recommend Blaster Master. It's a lot of fun. Okay, next up we have the Castlevania games. Now there are 3 that were released on the NES, and Castlevania 1 and 3 are very similar. Castlevania 2 is kind of the black sheep of the bunch, and I honestly didn't play that one very much, so I didn't really like it. It was really kind of obtuse and confusing, but I really liked Castlevania 3. This one came out later in the system's life cycle, but I just thought that it improved on the first Castlevania a bunch. Now, when you think of Castlevania, you might think of the Metroidvania genre, which is where you kind of level up as you go forward. That definitely happened in the original Metroid, but the old Castlevania games were not really like that. They were just action platformers. It wasn't until later that the RPG elements actually came into it with the TurboGrafx CD and then PlayStation 1. So these games are more straightforward kind of action titles, but I think they're a lot of fun, and I do love the whole whip element as well. I thought it was really neat. Anyway, I think that if you are going to play a Castlevania game, the first and second games are still really good, but the third one really takes the cake for me. I also think it has the best soundtrack among the 3 as well, and so it's just my favorite among the Castlevania games and definitely worth checking out. Now, next up we have Contra, and this one is definitely up there as my top NES games, and it's obviously one that I play all the time because I do the Contra test on my channel when I'm testing hardware. Now, I would consider Contra to be the quintessential Konami game. This one starts with only 3 lives, and so it's almost impossible to play with that many lives. However, you can put in the Konami code. That's going to be up, up, down, down, left, right, all that stuff. When you do that, you're going to get 30 lives, and that was basically essential for us. There was no way that we could beat this on our own. And so that was really cool to be able to have this kind of secret hack to be able to beat this game, so we really enjoyed that. On top of that, this one had 2-player co-op, and so you and a buddy could actually play at the same time, and it would make the whole experience a lot easier. Not only that, there's a good amount of variation to this game. We have different types of levels like the jungle and snow level, but then also there are other levels where you have a top-down or kind of forward-looking perspective. And so this game always felt like a huge blockbuster because you had those different perspectives, and then also it had like basically Rambo and Arnold Schwarzenegger on the front, and so we always kind of loved that idea of this game. I also love the fact that we have different power-ups that we can use that will change our weapon types, and everyone wanted the spread gun, and so we would always fight over that, but all the same, it was just a really fun experience, and I think it's still one of people's favorite NES games, and that's for a very good reason. And another thing is that it doesn't take a lot of time to beat the game. In fact, if you put in that Konami code, you can probably beat the game in under 30 minutes, and so it's just a really great sit-down experience. Okay, next we're going to talk about Double Dragon 2, but first we'll talk a little bit about Double Dragon 1. Now this was one of the very first beat-em-up games available for the NES, and so it was just really kind of an amazing game back then. And the first Double Dragon is also surprisingly complex because it has RPG elements to it. We didn't know what that was back in the day, we just knew that something happened. The longer you played the game, the more points you got, you would actually unlock more moves. And so when you first start the game, you can only punch and kick and jump, but later on you can uppercut and jump kick, and that becomes really important. Now this game also supported 2-player co-op, which was awesome, but it always turned into a competition because as you start punching a character, you would get more points. And so it turns into this fight to get the most points, you can get the upgraded skills. And so as a result, it always turned into a fight with me and my brothers. So I didn't really like playing Double Dragon 1 just because it was really hard to play on your own, but when playing with somebody else, they would always steal your points, and so it wasn't a great feeling. And so that's why I prefer Double Dragon 2 over Double Dragon 1. Number one, the sprites and the characters just looked a little bit better in the second one, but then also you started with all your skills right there in the beginning. So there was no competition when it came to the points or anything else like that. You really were just kind of working together, and I always enjoyed that more. And so when it came to Double Dragon, yeah, we really liked the first 2 games, but I liked the second one better. There was actually a third one, but we never really played it just because it came out really late in the NES life cycle, and so we never got an opportunity to play it. So Double Dragon 2 was the choice for me. This one was also a lot of fun to play on your own. It actually had a difficulty system. Now, if you played it at the very easiest difficulty, it was pretty easy to get through, but it wouldn't play the whole game. You actually had to play it at the harder difficulties to get through the whole story. It would actually just cut off at a certain level. But I also liked that idea because it allowed me to practice on those levels to get really good, and then I could move on to the harder levels later on. Anyway, yeah, if you're looking for a beat-em-up game, I think the Double Dragon series is really good. My favorite is Double Dragon 2, and there are other beat-em-up games that are really great. For example, the River City Ransom game. This again was another late in the NES lifecycle game that we didn't really play, but this one is also a really great game to play too. Okay, next up we have Dragon Warrior, and this was a really influential game for me, definitely in the top 5 for me when it comes to NES games. Now to start, this game actually came free if you subscribed to Nintendo Power in its first year. Now we didn't really have the money for that, so we didn't do that, but I had a friend who did, and so he had this game for free, and it was just awesome. And the thing about it was that it came with a map that also had some of the enemies on there as well. And so this is one of those very few games where we actually had all the information up front. It's not like we had the internet back in the day and we could look up a map. We often played these games like completely blind, but Dragon Warrior was one of those where you could see everything at once. And so that was just kind of a revelation to us that this game was so much bigger than we saw when we first started playing it, but we knew what we were getting ourselves into. And so that was a really great experience. In addition, Dragon Warrior was my very first role-playing game, and so I really enjoyed that experience. The idea of leveling up and grinding and getting experience, all that stuff was really fun. And you could upgrade your weapons to get a stronger sword, and then also there were like hidden items. You had to get like the special sword and shield and armor. And so this is a very deep and complex game, especially back in the day, and so we really enjoyed that experience. In fact, I still like playing through this game from time to time. It's kind of simple by today's standards. In fact, it's a little bit annoying sometimes. For example, you have to go into the menu and select the word door if you want to open up a door, or if you want to take the stairs, you have to select stairs. Like, it's not very intuitive. And there's a lot of nuances to it. For example, when you first start the game, all you're obsessed with is gold. You want to get as much money as possible because you see that in the store, there are some weapons that you can't quite afford just yet. So as you start to play these enemies, you start to focus on the ones that give you the most gold, because that's going to let you level up, at least in terms of your equipment, the fastest. However, as you get further into the game, you realize that experience is a lot more important. And so then you start trying to find those enemies that will give you more experience. In particular, there's one called the Metal Slime. This guy will run away every time you try to fight him, but at the same time, if you're able to kill him, it'll give you way more EXP than anything else in the game. And so that was always awesome. Anyway, I got a lot of fond memories of this game. It doesn't hold up very well nowadays just because of the mechanics, but all the same, if you're looking to go back into a time capsule of what role-playing games were back in the day, this is a really good experience. Okay, next up we have Life Force, and this is a Konami game as well, and it's actually an offshoot of a game called Gradius, which you've probably heard of, which is a lot more popular. Now, this game originally was called Salamander, both in Japan and I think Europe as well, but in North America, we knew it as Life Force. And this game had a lot of the same mechanics as the Gradius game. So you would kill these guys and it would give you a power-up, and then you could choose when to use it. So you could level up more and more as you progress further. So you could maybe make yourself faster right there in the beginning, but if you saved up your power-ups, you could then get the laser, which would like shoot through enemies, and so that was really helpful. Anyway, this game reminds me the most of Contra, because a lot of the sprites and assets are actually very similar. So when it comes to like explosions, it's very similar to Contra. And this one also thankfully used the Konami code, so you could get those 30 lives, which made it a lot easier to beat. This is a game we actually owned, and so we played through it all the time. If it was like a boring, rainy weekend, we would sit down together because it had co-op, and we would play through the game. And having 2 players on the screen made it a lot easier to get through the game. And so this is a game we used to beat all the time, and you can usually do it in about 30 minutes or less. This one also had a lot of variety when it came to levels, much like Contra, and so you had these side-scrolling typical levels, but then also top-down levels, which were kind of unique as well. So if you're looking for a shooting kind of game on the NES, I think that Life Force is really amazing, and it was my favorite among this type of games. Now the next game up is Little Nemo the Dream Master. Now I didn't know a lot about this game. All I knew is that it was made by Capcom, who made some really awesome games, but then also it had some really incredible graphics and a really cool gameplay and mechanic as well. Now later on I learned that this was based off of a movie, which is also based off of a comic strip from the early 20th century. I didn't know any of this stuff. In fact, this movie flopped in the US to the point where I didn't even know it came into the theaters. I never saw a trailer or anything else like that. All I knew is that we had this Little Nemo game that looked amazing. And all that being said, the existence of the movie didn't really take anything away from the game itself, which had a really nice kind of complex story as well. Essentially, you play as this little boy who goes off into Slumberland, and while you're there, you've got a bunch of candy, and so you can throw it at these random animals, and then when they fall asleep, you can jump into those animals, and it basically becomes an animal suit. And so this was a really neat mechanic that would give you special powers, so depending on where you were in the level, this would get you through the next section. And so I never really got really far in this game because it is very difficult, but I do remember playing as a frog, which could like swim in the water really quickly, but then also jump really high. And there was also the mole character, and that guy could like dig through the dirt and also ran pretty quickly as well, but he couldn't jump. Also later on in the game, you get a wand, which can be used as a weapon, which makes things a little bit easier, so it kind of had this nice kind of upgrade mechanic to it as well. Anyway, among all of the other Capcom games, including like DuckTales and Darkwing Duck, this was the one that I liked the most, and so this is the one that made the list. Now, another Capcom game that was a lot more popular is Mega Man 2. Now, there were actually 6 Mega Man games released for the NES, but some of those came out a lot later in the life cycle, and so there were very few copies of them. In fact, if you own Mega Man 4, 5, or 6 on the NES, it's worth a lot of money. Personally, I only have Mega Man 2. I can't afford those other ones, but it is pretty awesome that they had 6 total games available for the system. And I gotta be honest, the first Mega Man just flew under my radar. I never heard of it or anything, but when Mega Man 2 came out, it got really popular, and so that's the game that I know the best. And of course, all the trademark things from Mega Man are available in Mega Man 2. Number 1, you can choose your level right in the beginning, so you have a bunch of choice, but then also it is very hard, so this is a very difficult game. But the thing that makes Mega Man games so amazing is that it gets a little bit easier the longer you play it. So as you beat an end boss, you absorb their powers, and now you can use those powers to help you with the other levels. Now there's an entire map that you're supposed to use when you go through, like you start with one enemy and then you go on from there. Honestly, I was so bad at this game, I never really got to that point, so I just treated each of those levels as like standalone levels. Can I beat this level? And so that was kind of the way that I played the game back in the day. These games are still very hard for me, and I can only beat the game with cheats, but all the same, it's just a really fun experience. I'm not saying that Mega Man 2 is the best among all of the 6 that are there. I think that it's probably the most well-regarded, but it's just the one that I'm most familiar with. And so I think that if you want to play any of the Mega Man games on NES, it's going to be a great time, but for me, I recommend Mega Man 2. Now next up we have Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! This one's pretty unique. It was actually officially licensed to have Mike Tyson in it. It actually had him on the cover, but then also he was the end boss. However, at some point the license expired and they didn't renew it, and I think a lot of that had to do with how shady Mike Tyson was at the time. But then later on they also released an official version called Punch-Out!, and that had a different end boss. It was called Mr. Dream, and this was essentially Mike Tyson just with a different skin. Now the Punch-Out! Games were actually remakes of original arcade games that came out way before that, and so it was kind of cool cool to be able to see these on a home console. And I gotta say that this game was pretty revolutionary. Number one, it was a one-on-one fighting game. You can remember with like Street Fighter II and stuff, those games didn't really come to NES and those came out a little bit later. And so to have a 1v1 fighting game was pretty amazing. It's obviously a different mechanic than when it comes to like a Street Fighter game, but all the same, it was pretty cool to have this like huge boxing sprite that you were fighting against. And the other thing that was really unique is that each of the different boxers that you fought against had their own different mechanics to it. So you kind of had to memorize the patterns and the timings for each of them. And so it was a deceptively complex game when it came down to it. In fact, I would argue this is one of the very first rhythm games because you had to memorize the feel, the timing of it, and it had kind of a musical property to it. And so I really enjoyed that aspect of the game in that it was very different in terms of timing and everything else compared to other games. So we really enjoyed this one. And this game was also very popular. Like all our friends had it. And it was funny because some of us were better at certain characters than others. And so like 5 of us would get around, we would play this game and be like, okay, who's good at Sandman? I'm good at Sandman. Okay, you play Sandman. Who's good at Bald Bull? You play him. You know, that kind of thing. And so it was always a lot of fun to have your friends around because we each had our own skill set. Okay, next up we have a very weird entry into the catalog, but this is a game I really loved, and it's Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. Now, this is based off of the movie that came out around the same time, and the reason why I like this one so much is because it had a lot of variety to it, and it was also a very short playthrough. This is a game we didn't own, and so we would rent it all the time. But if you played it and memorized the game, you could actually beat it in a weekend, and so that was always super awesome. Now, I really loved the Robin Hood movie. I thought that Kevin Costner was super cool. He had like really cool hair, but then also he was like really good at the bow and arrow. And me and my brothers, we always liked to play bow and arrow, and that guy was just like super good. And so we always wanted to be Robin Hood. But in addition, the game was pretty decent. It would follow the whole story of the movie, but then also it had several different gameplay mechanics. For the most part, you play in a top-down kind of perspective, and you've got a sword and you can kind of slash people. The mechanic itself is pretty difficult and it's really an unfair game. But then also there were other gameplay elements. For example, there was a duel mechanic. So when you got into certain boss battles, you had to fight like kind of like fencing. And so that was kind of cool. But then also during some bigger moments in the game, it would zoom out a bunch and it would be kind of like a gauntlet style game at that point. And in this mechanic, you would take control of one character and then you would fight as many enemies as you could. But if you got hit and died, then you would have to take control of a different character. And then you would kind of keep going until you had all of your characters dead. And the hope was that you would kill all the other characters before your last character died. And so yes, this is a game that's very difficult, but I really enjoyed it because you could play through it in a weekend, and it was also tied to one of my favorite movies at the time, so it's definitely worth checking out. Okay, next up is a game that's like super mysterious to me. This game is called Shadow of the Ninja, and this is a game we owned, but I don't remember actually buying it. I think it's something that maybe our parents bought us, and I'm not sure why they bought it. Maybe it was on sale or whatever, but it turns out this is actually a pretty rare game. And it's a side-scrolling ninja type game, so very similar to Ninja Gaiden and also very difficult. But the cool thing about this one is that it had unlimited continues, and so you could kind of power your way through it. And then later on, we also learned that there are cheat codes. You can look these up on the internet now today, and it actually will allow you to start on any level that you want. And so that did make the game a lot easier to play. Now the game itself looked very good, but it also had really smooth gameplay. And it also had a leveling up mechanic. You would start out with a sword, but you could level that up, and the more you leveled it up, the longer the sword would get. And so it would get easier and easier to kill the enemies. In addition, you had an alternative weapon, which was kind of like a sickle attached to a chain. And so you'd throw that, and it had a much longer range, but it wouldn't work very well in close quarters. And so you kind of had to be strategic about which weapon you wanted to use on which level. Anyway, this is a game my brothers and I played all the time. It also had co-op, which would make the game easier. And so this one is definitely near the top of my list in favorite NES games of all time. And I definitely recommend checking it out if you want to play an action game on this system. Now on the opposite side of action is our next game, which is called Shadowgate. This is actually a port of a Macintosh game from back in the day. There was a whole series of games called Mac Adventure games, which include Deja Vu, as well as Shadowgate, and then another one called Uninvited. And those games were originally in black and white, but when they moved it over to NES, it had full color. And there were not a lot of point and click games on the NES, but this one, plus Deja Vu and Uninvited, were 3 games that worked really well on the system. And these were also very immersive games because they were in a first-person perspective, which was really rare on the NES. Now the gameplay mechanics itself was not very easy to use. You can imagine you have to use a D-pad to move the cursor around, so it's a very slow and plodding experience, especially compared to something like the Macintosh, which had a mouse. However, my brothers and I spent a lot of time playing this game. This is a game that we owned, and it was one that we would bust out when we were like super bored. We were done playing like the action titles, and we wanted to get further in Shadowgate. And so just by hook and crook, we figured out how to beat this game over time. It had a hint mechanic, but the funny thing about the hints was that in the beginning, it would tell you some very clear hints, but by the time it got to like the end of the game, they weren't helpful at all. And so you really had to figure it out. Again, this is like pre-internet. And so we would like ask our friends, or we would like, just use the rumor mill. But eventually we figured out how to beat this game. I don't know how we got past the Sphinx, but somehow we figured that out. Anyway, this is a really interesting game to try if you want to play an old school point and click adventure in a first person perspective. It's not a very fast paced game at all, but if you're looking for something that's just kind of quintessentially 1980s, this is a really good choice. Now, I've always been very fond of Shadowgate, but it's a game that I have not replayed since back in the day, and it's also never really compelled me to play the other games in the series, so I've never played Deja Vu, which is like a detective story, and then also Uninvited, which is like a horror-oriented version. So maybe at some point I'll play those games, but for now, I'm just going to kind of treasure those memories and then move on from there. Okay, next up is Super Mario Bros. 2, which is my all-time favorite NES game and also still my favorite Mario game. And I think we should start by talking about the other games first. We'll start with Mario 1. Now, when people bought the NES, most of the time it came with Mario Brothers and Duck Hunt. We, however, bought it very early in its life cycle, and so it wasn't an option for us. We ended up getting Gyromite, which came with Rob the Robot. And this was a puzzle game that was pretty terrible, but this was the only thing we had. It also came with Duck Hunt, so we played that a lot. But essentially, Mario Brothers was a game that we only saw at other people's houses. It wasn't a game that we actually owned. And so when it came down to it, this is just a game that I wasn't very familiar with. I never really played the first Mario Brothers. Instead, everything changed when Mario Brothers 2 came out. In fact, this was the very first game that was shown on the first cover of Nintendo Power, and man, this game looked amazing. And so when that first came out, we bought it right up. I think all of us, like my brothers and I, we all asked for this game collectively for our Christmas present that year, and it was amazing. And there's a million reasons why I love Mario 2 so much. Number one, you can choose between 4 different characters, which is a really new innovation back then, but then also there's no timer on the screen. And so there's no like ticking clock as you're playing, so you can kind of take your time and explore, which is kind of amazing. In addition, the game is just really weird. You probably know the backstory, but this game was not meant to be a Mario Brothers game. Instead, it was a game called Doki Doki Panic that was released in Japan specifically like for one festival. But when Mario 2 came out in Japan, which was like a harder version of Mario 1, they thought that the American audiences wouldn't like it. And so instead, they changed out all the skins and put Mario into it, and then released that as Mario 2 in the US. And this game was super popular to the point where they re-released it in Japan and called it Super Mario Bros. USA. Anyway, I just really love this game, and the fact that it was just weird and just had lots of secrets to it. And you also had like a jackpot thing at the end where you could earn extra lives just by using a chance game. And so this was a game that me and my brothers basically memorized. I knew every little nook and cranny in this game. We could beat this game in like 30 minutes, no problem. We always used like the warps so that we could get through the next levels. And of course, we mostly used Princess Peach because she had the float mechanic, which gave you a huge advantage. Now, she was kind of weak, so she couldn't pull the items very quickly, but all the same, she was super essential in a lot of those games where you kind of needed to avoid a lot of bullets and things like that. So anyway, I'm not going to talk too much about Mario 2 because you probably already heard it, but yeah, this definitely deserved a place on my list. In fact, it's at the top. Now, later on, Mario 3 came out, and a lot of people will say that objectively that's a better game, and I agree in some ways. It's definitely a huge upgrade from Mario 1, but for me, I liked Mario 2 better, just because it was just a little bit better of a playthrough for me. It didn't have that timer, and then also I could choose all my different characters. But yeah, Mario 3 is amazing too. You know, you have like the raccoon tail suit, and then also the Tanuki suit. You know, those things are kind of amazing, but for me, I would still argue that Mario 2 is my favorite. Okay, next up we have a sports game. So this is Tecmo Super Bowl, and honestly, this is probably the primary sports game that we played as kids. Number one, this was an officially licensed game, and that was pretty rare, so you could actually play as the actual teams and the actual players. And so it was always great to play as your favorite football star, because for me, this was like the heyday of NFL. You know, you had like Barry Sanders and John Elway and, you know, Joe Montana, and so that stuff was really awesome. In addition, this is a very complex game. You could play through a whole season as your favorite team, and it was multiplayer, so you could have multiple players playing at once. So I would be the 49ers every time, but if someone else wanted to be like the Seahawks or the Cowboys, they could do that as well. In addition, you could change out the roster yourself, so you could change out your players. Some of them would get injured, so you had to change them anyway. But then also it tracked all of your stats. And so if you wanted to compete with your friends to see who could get the most passing or rushing yards, you could do that, and that was pretty awesome. And so many times my friends and I would sit down and be like, okay, let's play through a season of Tecmo Super Bowl together over a weekend. We each would pick our team and then see who could win the Super Bowl. And of course, the gameplay was really great too. You had a bunch of different plays you could choose from, and you could customize that as well. So really, the sky's the limit when it comes to playing Tecmo Super Bowl. In fact, this game is so popular that they still do continuous roster updates, so you can get these ROM hacks where you can play like the 2022 or 2023 season of this game. And so this is still one of my favorite sports and football games of all time. I still will play this. I actually will turn on cheats or use save states, and so I try to get a perfect game where I get 99-0 against the computer, and it's a lot of fun. And I always play as the 49ers, and I'm mostly just passing from Joe Montana to Jerry Rice. It's the perfect combo. Okay, next up is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game. There were actually 3 Turtles games released for the NES. Now, the first game came out before the arcade game, and it was very different. This was a side-scrolling game, and it was super difficult. It had a top-down like world element to it as well, but when it came down to it, this was a game that we would rent all the time because we had Turtle Mania, we loved the show and all that, and so we wanted to play Turtles games, but at the same time, this game was just way too difficult for us. So it was a game that we played a lot, but kind of hated. Now, when the arcade game came out, this kind of blew our minds. The graphics were amazing. It looked just like the cartoon to us. And so this was a game we threw a bunch of quarters at anytime that we could. Now later on, the NES port came out, and it's kind of a sorry port compared to the arcade game in the sense that the graphics are much worse, but most of the other gameplay elements are still there, and so we loved playing this game, and we played it all the time. And to be honest, we didn't really notice the difference in graphics. It was just kind of amazing that we could play the arcade game at home without having to throw a bunch of quarters into it. Now later on, Turtles 3 came out, and I think most people would say that objectively that one is the better game, but for us, Turtles 2 was just amazing. It was an arcade game that we could play at home. That was a very rare thing back then. Anyway, if you have the option now to play the Turtles arcade game, I would recommend playing it on arcade, but still the NES has a soft spot in my heart. Okay, and the last game on our list is going to be Wizards and Warriors. This is also a game that we owned, and we had a love and hate relationship with it. Again, a very difficult game, but it had some pretty cool mechanics to it, and a lot of variety when it came to levels. And believe it or not, this game was developed by Rare. This is a company that would later on make like Battletoads and all the other games on the Nintendo 64, but at the time, this was one of their very first games that they ever developed. And there are actually 3 games in this series, but I've only really played the first one. The second one actually had Fabio on the cover, which is kind of amazing. And the third game came out really late in the life cycle, and so that was a game I never even saw until later on. Now, Wizards and Warriors is a platforming game and has a lot of jumping to it. In fact, there's a lot of verticality to this game in general. The core mechanic of this game is that you have to jump from the bottom of some sort of tree or whatever and get all the way to the top of it. Meanwhile, all these enemies are coming at you, and so it becomes a very difficult process. This game also had some role-playing elements to it. For example, you would find a key that would unlock chests that you would need for later on. And so each level had a layer of complexity to it, and you basically had to memorize the entire map. And like I mentioned, this game was very difficult. In fact, back in the day, we never beat this game. We got pretty far, but we never got to that final point of actually finishing the game. Nowadays, it's a lot easier because we have cheat codes, but back then, man, this was a really hard game. However, it was one that we owned, and so when we were really bored, much like with Shadowgate, this is one that we would bust out, and so we would try really hard, and we memorized a lot of this game as well. Now, I wouldn't call this a must-have title for the NES, but all the same, if you're looking for a good challenge, this one's pretty fun. And like I mentioned, it's got some pretty deep gameplay mechanics to it as well, so if you're looking for like an 8-bit version of Elden Ring, this one's pretty fun. Okay, so that's really about it for this video. I wanted to go over my favorite games, and this video got pretty long, but I hope you enjoyed this walk through memory lane. And the amazing thing about the NES catalog is that I only scratched the surface. For example, I didn't even talk about Zelda or Kirby. Those are also awesome games, but just didn't quite make the cut for me. So let me know what you think about this type of video in the comments down below. Do you want to hear more about NES games or other systems? And also, what were your favorite NES games? I'd love to see your top 10 or top 15 list as well. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.